Greetings, pilgrims. I just want you guys to know that I'm not trying to stir the hornet's nest here. I know it might seem like I'm saying, oh, only man babies like Star Wars, true gentlemen like desert planets with space cocaine. But that's not what I'm saying. So, Denis Villeneuve, the director of the new Dune movie, commented some years back that Dune was Star Wars for adults. And is that a condescending statement? Maybe, but there is truth to it, even if it implies that Dune is more complex, more profound, more highbrow, more je ne sais quoi than Star Wars. Let me be clear, I actually enjoy Star Wars more than I do Dune. And there is one aspect of Star Wars which in my opinion is far superior to anything in the Dune novels, and which is more fulfilling, but I'll explain that later. My point is that saying that Dune is Star Wars for adults doesn't mean that Dune is necessarily superior to Star Wars in all its forms. It just means that Dune is not afraid to make more serious reflections about politics, science, the human condition, gender relations, class structure, suffering, hope, religion, etc. By comparison, Star Wars can be more like, oh man, cool laser fights, pew 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 pew. And as I get older, I do appreciate Dune more than I do Star Wars. At least for the political science and the anthropology aspect, which I personally find very fascinating. And I say this even though I'm only recently getting into Dune, while for the longest time I have lived and breathed Star Wars. I was so obsessed that I kid you not, I had received dreams during the night with my own version of each of the sequel trilogy movies before each of them came out in theaters. And by the way, my dream stories were way better than every single one of those movies. And it was always a huge disappointment every time I went to the theaters to see the real thing. And then I'd be like, my subconscious is way more creative than whatever Hollywood hacks conjured this up from Hollywood hell. And I also believe that Star Wars as a mythos might even be more long-lasting in the culture than Dune overall. Star Wars can actually be the American Iliad. You know, the cultural epic of the United States that will be enjoyed, retold, studied for thousands of years, as our descendants all live under the hegemony of the Martian military or something. And I say this considering that Star Wars and Dune came out just one decade apart from each other. Yet Star Wars has been a consistent force in the global imagination, influencing every single social class of every culture all over the world, while Dune has mostly been a thing for preppy, well-educated nerd types going all, yes, we are part of the intelligentsia. Yet even so, Dune is still Star Wars for adults, because it's a more intellectual work than Star Wars. For one simple reason, Dune is actually promising us that Star Wars is the future. That's right, Dune is better than Star Wars because Dune is promising us that we're going to see the full immersion Star Wars experience, my friends. Or at least our descendants will, in around 10,000 years. I say this mostly as a joke, because, you know, if Dune is right, my descendants are probably just gonna be planetary peasants and some space dukes fiefdom, harvesting green milk from space cow titties under the hot double suns or something. And I know that liking something as fiction doesn't mean you want to live in it. Just ask Hunger Games fans. My point, however, with all this is that people often forget one extremely basic fact about Frank Herbert's Dune. Turns out the story about predicting the future through prescience was itself an attempt at prescience. And I don't blame people for forgetting this, because with the giant worms, the magical space drugs, the floating celestial mind monsters, it almost feels like Lord of the Rings in space, which is what Arthur C. Clarke compared it to. I myself have a video comparing both works, and if you'd like to see it, I'll drop a link. Yeah, this is hilarious, because Tolkien didn't like Dune. He disliked it with some intensity, apparently. And Star Wars is similar to Dune because Star Wars is fantasy in space, basically. Which incidentally ends up being similar to a sci-fi story about future feudalism, which is Dune. But this is also hilarious because Herbert didn't like Star Wars, and he suspected that George Lucas had ripped him off, and Herbert had to fight the constant urge to sue Lucasfilm for plagiarism. Am I the only one who finds it funny that all these great creators of the 20th century all had beef with each other? Of course, Dune probably served as an inspiration for Star Wars, since the books came out a decade before, but the similarities might also be due to the fact that both works take inspiration from King Arthur, but add spaceships. And the similarities between the two franchises actually increased as time went on, and the extended universe stuff of Star Wars became more established. Both universities have several religious devout warrior orders, like the Sardaukar and the Fremen in Dune, while Star Wars has the Jedi and the Mandalorian. Both universes have all-female orders of witches, like the Bene Gesserit in Dune, and the Daughters of Dathomir in Star Wars. Both have royalty and nobility who govern entire planets. In Dune it's obvious, but in Star Wars you have Duchess Satine of Mandalore, the elective monarchy in Naboo, and whatever dynasty Leia was supposed to be adopted into. Not to mention the desert planets and vague Chosen One prophecies present in both stories. But this is all superficial stuff. The more deeper element is how superhuman qualities certain people have in both franchises naturally creates a hierarchy where those with such powers naturally rise up to the top levels of the social hierarchy. These powers include the ability to influence other people's minds by speaking, or enhanced combat prowess, or the ability to see the future. And the fact that in both these universes military combat still includes a lot of close quarters fighting means that it tends to favor the rule of a warrior class, because those with time to dedicate their entire lives to combat naturally gain an edge over those who don't. So the modern system of having warriors be less relevant in politics, as it is in our age, can't really be a thing in Dune or Star Wars, because military classes who are essential to state power end up taking over the state eventually. You can only avoid that if every citizen is a soldier, and that's hard to do with close quarter combat, which involves a lot of skill. It's not like back in the Napoleonic era where it was just like 2 boxes of lunatics shooting little pellets at each other, which was one of the origins of the modern era. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I'm saying is that the world building in both universes has the political and social structure of the universe connected to how combat works, which is pretty cool. But there's way more to it. You're barely into the proverbial rabbit hole, my friends. The main reason why Dune seems like fantasy in space is because fantasy is based off of medieval culture, and Dune is operating off of a theory that states that the history of civilization works in cycles due to natural laws, most of them having to do with evolution and the environment surrounding the civilization, which forces humanity to behave in a certain way to survive. If you actually understand what Dune is trying to say about history, political science, anthropology, ecology, etc., you can actually become big-brained through osmosis while enjoying a cool story about space jihadists riding giant worms. And Frank Herbert talks about Dune being a work of prediction. What he means is that eventually current historical trends will turn human civilization into a highly religious, unequal, and hierarchical society run by a set of customs and norms. This will occur in part due to certain developments in science and technology that will be forced upon us due to the nature of the universe. Basically, we will scientific revolution ourselves so hard we will revolve all the way back to where we started before the so-called scientific revolution. Like how advanced military technology and development of superhuman abilities can make melee combat effective again, and make some humans objectively superior to others in the use of force, pun intended, which then makes their dominance as a class inevitable. Yet George Lucas has a bit of an optimistic view in his version of a medieval-esque society in space, complete with the idealistic Jedi who are basically a syncretic Christian, Buddhist, New Age, cosmic Templar type organization. Though it's popular these days to call them a cult of emotionally traumatized child soldiers on YouTube, but from George Lucas's perspective, he wasn't trying to be an edgy pessimist. The Jedi were indeed meant to represent hope, goodness, virtues, etc., even if they made mistakes. However, Dune is like, I foresee an era where the unceasing development of machines of war, mercantile competition, and religious fervor create a society of powerful aristocrats who use science and faith to rule over society, because only through hierarchy can civilization exist, as equality will not be possible as some humans evolve more than others, making equality the greatest illusion of all in this new era. While Star Wars is like, I want a frog man fighting robots with space knights. My point is that Frank Herbert isn't exploring these ideas with any childlike wonder of knights in the stars. He's analyzing class systems. That's why Dune is Star Wars for adults. Like I said before in other videos, Frank Herbert is trying to be an impartial observer of reality and explain how human civilization works, and perhaps even predict the future by observing our current trends, and he literally arrives at Warhammer 40k, just by logic. That's what he thinks the future is going to be like, except the God Emperor is a giant worm. But he concludes this because the concept of super warriors with psychic powers would naturally be revered religiously by the plebs, if you think about it. It's human nature, because of course super psychic warriors would be revered. If worshipping an emperor happened in our own world, as recently as the 20th century in Japan,
to the 70 million people of Japan, Hirohito, their emperor, is a god. through direct descent from the great sun goddess Amaterasu. They believe that he personally owns Japan, its land, its resources, and even themselves.
And Emperor Hirohito is just a normal guy. So of course it's gonna happen in the future if an emperor gets superpowers. Maybe that's why the Sith Empire in Star Wars keeps winning and coming back in Star Wars no matter what the Republic does. If you think about it, Palpatine is more in tune with human nature than the Republic is, because people in general need a powerful person to admire, more than they need a faceless government system protecting their rights. It's our instinct to follow leaders, which is precisely what Dune is exploring. The leader takes up the mantle of the fatherly role, deeply embedded in the human psyche, which is explained by human biology. The father protects and provides for us when we're vulnerable children. That's why we tend to follow powerful men who promise to protect us and to take us to better living conditions. Because the leaders are playing into our need for fathers or mothers, like how the Fremen revere Paul as divine when they realize that he can improve their lives. They are vulnerable and abandoned, and they're like orphans in need of a patriarch. My love of Star Wars makes me love Dune that much more, because Dune explains the very elements we see in Star Wars. And the most interesting thing for me is that Dune explains how something like Star Wars could literally happen in our own future, if we ever get to see superhumans, because of CRISPR or whatever. If you don't want to live in the Star Wars universe, or wish it to be real, you're not a real Star Wars fan, are you? Therefore you have to admit Dune is better because it's conceiving of a way to bring us Star Wars in the real world. Checkmate, Star Wars fans. I'm just kidding. But I am serious about why I personally am more intrigued with Dune these days, and why I study Dune more with scrutiny than I ever did with Star Wars. Star Wars was always good fun and is more fulfilling than Dune for me, because Dune is overly cynical and there's no genuine hero in the story and everything is about Machiavellian politics, while Star Wars portrays heroism and the human search for religious connection to something greater as a real positive force that can indeed keep evil at bay, even if it's just for a while. In contrast, Dune has things play out as a constant spiral into different forms of tyranny, and even our main characters reveal themselves to be extremely tyrannical. But despite this, when it comes to the broader portrayal of human civilization, Dune definitely has a point in its analysis. And the funny thing is that it inadvertently explains how the cultures and factions work in Star Wars as well. The same principles apply to both franchises, which means that Dune can enrich your reading of Star Wars and your understanding of the lore in Star Wars. Why? Because of this.
The idea that technology is values neutral, values agnostic, and people can use it for constructive or destructive purposes, but it doesn't predispose anything, it's just silly and naive. Technology elicits patterns of human behavior because those who utilize it and get ahead end up behaving differently because of their utilization of it, and then other people, then they end up shaping the world, or other people race to also get the power of the technology. And so there's, corresponding with the use of a plow, animism went away everywhere that it existed, because you can't talk about the spirit of the buffalo while beating the cow all day long to pull a plow. So the moment that we do animal husbandry of that kind, where you have to beat the cow all day, you have to say it's just a dumb animal, man has dominion over earth, and the nature of even our religious and spiritual ideas change. So we have to look at what the psychological effects of specific tech applied certain ways are, and be able to say it's not just doing the first order thing you intended. It's doing, like, the effect on patriarchy and animism and the end of tribal culture and the beginning of empire and the class systems that came with that. Not, like, we can go on and on about what the plow did. The beginning of surplus was inheritance, which then became the capital model, and like lots of things. So we have to say, when we're looking at the tech, what are the values built into the way the tech is being built that are not obvious? The change of the behavior will also change the values in the society. It's kind of well understood that the printing press and then in early industrialism ended feudalism and created kind of nation states. So one thing I would say as a long trend that we can look at is that whenever there is a step function, a major leap in technology, physical technology, the underlying techno-industrial base with which we do stuff, it ends up predisposing a whole bunch of human behavioral patterns that the previous social system had not emerged to try to solve. And so it usually ends up breaking the previous social systems, the way the plow broke the tribal system, the way that the Industrial Revolution broke the feudal system. And then new social systems have to emerge that can deal with the new powers, the new dispositions, whatever with that tech. Obviously, the nuke broke nation-state governance being adequate and said we can't ever have that again. So then it created this international governance apparatus world.
So you see, technological and scientific development brought us out of medieval feudalism, but they can bring us back into it. Some say we're already in it, and they call it techno-feudalism, but that's another topic having to do with social media monopolies from big tech Californians. The kind of future medievalism postulated by Dune, and similarly depicted in Star Wars, has more to do with military technology and human evolution. Simply put, if the most effective weapons of war used by warriors require a lifetime of training, like the sword and the armor did for the samurai and the knights in our own historical feudal eras, and if these weapons are combined with human evolution giving us certain human beings with superpowers, then modern society as we understand it now, based on our values of secular egalitarianism and social progress, is not possible to sustain. Such developments in science will alter human behavior to such an extent that we won't believe in modern values of equality anymore, because it will be impossible to pretend it exists. Not when your leader has psychic powers or any other extreme ability. Our values will necessarily change. And if you think about it, what are the values of the Republic in Star Wars? A lot of people seem to just assume that the Republic in Star Wars is analogous to the American Republic, and yeah, I guess it is an allegory of a sort, but it does exist in its own little universe, and it doesn't work like the American Republic at all, or any other form of modern republic that we know of. In Star Wars, there is certainly no separation of church and state, since the Republic basically has an ecclesiastical religious order as its primary military branch, which enforces its values throughout the galaxy via its mastery of violence. And it's been a while since I leafed through the pages of the extended universe, and I haven't touched much on the Disney stuff, but I do recall that the Jedi and the Republic merged as a political entity, because the Jedi saw the Republic as promoting similar values to what they were championing. Because if you think about it, the Jedi don't tolerate political independence, as they fight a war against the Separatists in the prequels. They seem quick to not allowing other political factions forming independently from their influence, which means that the Jedi don't respect self-determination. What about equality? Does the Star Wars Republic believe in equality? Not exactly, since the Senate seems very elitist if you think about it. It's composed by nobles and royals, and every member group in the Republic seems to be some kind of monarchy. Aside from the ones I mentioned, you also have the Calamari monarchy and the Gungan monarchy. There are democracies in the Republic, like the Pantora Assembly, and the lore does seem to state that the various societies are going through a progressive march towards a more egalitarian free society, at least in the Republic. But I would take that more seriously if they had, bought the slave army of brainwashed manufactured people genetically conditioned to serve the Republic to the death. Pro tip, guys, if you're less moral than Daenerys Targaryen, you can't pretend to be a champion of freedom. And don't get me started on the values of the Sith Empires or the Mandalorians. As bad as the Republic is, it's the faction that's the most similar to our values in the Star Wars universe, despite still falling short. Because no, modern society can't really exist in Star Wars. It's Darwinianly impossible, because an equality-focused modern society would be crushed by the competition of the more medieval-minded societies around it, because of the technology and type of people available. Try marching a citizen soldier army of plebs against any force wielder or trained Mandalorian. They would get slaughtered, and citizen army of common plebs is basically the backbone of any democracy, of any modern democracy, as it's postulated by Machiavelli and other political scientists. Because let's be real, the rifle basically invented modern society. Before it, the state depended on the loyalty of an expert warrior class or the ability to pay mercenaries. Although the commoners were still a part of medieval warfare, like the English longbowmen, and commoners are also seen in wars in Star Wars, the commoners can simply not contend against an experienced member of a ruling warrior class. They could only do so after they gained the ability to just shoot the guy in fancy armor from a distance. With the advent of the rifle, the creation of mass armies of commoners became advantageous as a military resource. So the citizen warrior concept took over, making every man vote as long as he fulfilled his military duties and fought for the state when called upon, advantageous for the state. Of course, the rich members of society could always get out of the draft, and I'm oversimplifying what happened beyond belief, but the point is, modern liberal democracy, or even mass socialist movements, became powerful in the modern era and suddenly became able to outcompete pre-modern societies that are class-based and monarchic because of the democratization of force. Before democracy could exist politically, first you had to make democracy exist on the battlefield. Every man being able to vote coincides with every man being able to shoot with a simple, easy to use and easy to manufacture weapon of war. Before such a weapon of war, the peasants could revolt in the Middle Ages, and they did revolt all the time. But one knight in armor could kill scores of peasants all by himself, which is why the system never changed until technology changed. Which means that technology and science could change everything again once more. And this time it could make democracy not work anymore. Because the moment that a single man who trained his whole life in the use of a new type of force field technology, or trained his whole life with his eugenics-induced superpowers, or both, like in good old Paul Atreides here, and the moment that this man can effectively kill 100 common foot soldiers with worse equipment and training by himself, once that happens, you have killed egalitarianism as a social value because it's unworkable. There is no point in treating everyone as equal, and you start reviewing powerful nobles or knights as being superior to the common man, and you start developing social values of the naturally powerful become naturally more deserving of political power. Power becomes a privilege and a duty with those that already have access to it, and it's no longer a right belonging to everyone, which is why democracy, quote-unquote, works a little funny in Star Wars, and the Star Wars democracy is more of a Athenian Greek democracy, which is basically a citizen aristocracy with slaves, because the Republic of Star Wars does have slaves, the clones are slaves, so it's not really a modern democracy. And in Dune, I don't even have to say anything, it's feudalism in space. My point with all this is that this is the value of Dune as a work from Frank Herbert's analytical mind. He's having a mature analysis. He's doing a mature reflection on human society. And this is the one thing that he discovers and that he is trying to convey to us. Or one of the things that he's trying to convey to us, in my opinion. And this, what I'm about to explain, is basically a law of nature. Alright, so what Dune is showing us is that if we become unnecessary to manifest the power of the state, we no longer participate in the power of the state, and thus voting loses its relevance. This is why Machiavelli explains the draft as a good sign for democracy, because it means that your state needs you for its own power, so you participate in the power and get the vote. We might hate the draft, and for good reason. It might even seem as a kind of slavery, as Heinlein famously once said, and I might get into that in another video. But if you think about it, when current technology means that those in power can rely on a small force of volunteers and mercenaries for their endless wars, and they don't need you anymore, that's when you know a new warrior class is about to be formed, and that you are in the twilight years of your universal suffrage, and you are also in the twilight years of the modern era as we know it. But I'll explain this more when I talk about Starship Troopers in the future, or do another video about feudalism in Frank Herbert's magnum opus. If you guys want that, let me know down in the comments. Hopefully I'm not rambling more than usual and saying a bunch of nonsense. Back to Star Wars and Dune. In conclusione, Dune explains how Star Wars is actually a feasible scenario for humanity in many ways, and Dune's relevance in our era will only grow as our reality experiences changes that indicate just how prophetic Herbert was. As military technology starts producing crazy new expensive toys like exoskeleton suits and the use of mercenaries and private police rise, and CRISPR promises to change some aspects of human nature, and CRISPR promises to produce designer babies, this will weaken the influence of modern values as inequality will only rise, and the power of the modern nation states might be threatened by the rise of private militaries owned by genetically altered super elites. And in our era of incredibly wealthy men taking leadership of the space race, I can almost see Frank Herbert winking at us from the afterlife while whispering, "You ain't seen nothing yet." And I haven't even gotten into the rise of religiosity worldwide, and what this means for the future of religious institutions. As contrary to common popular belief, apparently, the rise of technology has not hampered the growth of religion.
Religion will do well in the 21st century. I don't mean that completely as a good thing. It's sort of a value-neutral proposition. But let me develop it a bit more. I believe the 21st century will be a century of deep belief. I was recently in Turkey, and it was the first time I was in Turkey for 20 years. And I noticed two things. more burqas, more niqabs, more facial covering of women, more scarves covering their hair, etc. It had become a vastly more devout society. At the same time, everyone had their face in their smartphones, which 20 years ago was not the case. More technology, more religion. That's not a contradiction in terms.
Which also fits with Dune's predictions, but I would talk about that in another video. But yeah, all this simply illustrates why Dune is Star Wars for adults, because it seeks to explain what you're observing, and to peel back the layers to find some of the dirt under the carpet, while Star Wars is more content with innocently portraying something more akin to a myth or a fairy tale. George Lucas is the guy who tells you a nice story about a princess, and Herbert is the kind of guy who tells you that the princess has serfs dying of plague in her realm. And with the success of Dune in cinemas, and how Disney has been having trouble with Star Wars fans, for good reason I might add, I can indeed see Dune gaining more traction in popular culture. Though I do admit that it's hard for Dune's overly analytical style to compete with the emotional experience of Star Wars. Is being more quote-unquote adult or mature mean that Dune is better than Star Wars? Well, definitely from an intellectual perspective, but deep reflections on the human condition is not the only way to produce fulfilling stories. There is a place for stories meant for the intellects of adults, and those meant for the innocence of children. Both are great. One seeks to explain the human condition, the other seeks to enrich it with a deep emotional experience, steeped in the innocence of one's inner child. However, right now in our day and age, Dune is a specifically useful work of fiction, as it explains how the Star Wars universe works, and as it explains how our world is working right now. And I mean the book, not the movie. Anyway, yeah, sorry for this kind of dead video. I just really wanted to talk about this subject, and I want to visit this subject again in future videos. But I do intend on making more fun and shorter videos, just making short reflections about pop culture later on. As for now, thank you all for listening to my ramblings. Have a good day, my friends.